The screening shells had barely stopped when the German officer realized something was terribly wrong. His fortified position on the Sicilian coast should have held for days, maybe weeks. The Americans had just landed hours ago. The beach should still be chaos. Yet his radio operator was dead, throat slit without a sound, and the officer could hear nothing but the wind through the olive groves. No boots crunching gravel, no shouted commands, no engine rumbles. Just an eerie, suffocating silence that made his skin crawl. In that moment he understood the reports that High Command had dismissed as panic and cowardice. The ghost warriors were real, and they were already inside his perimeter 3 months earlier, across the Atlantic in Oklahoma. These same men had been dismissed by their own army brass as a potential liability. The 45th Infantry Division was unlike any other American unit preparing for the invasion of Europe. Nearly 40% of the 180th Regiment were Native Americans, pulled from reservations across the Southwest. Apaches, Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Seminoles, and Navajos had answered the call to arms, enlisting to fight an enemy on the other side of the world. But the American military establishment didn't know what to do with them. Training officers whispered concerns that these men were too independent, too unpredictable, too connected to old ways that had no place in modern mechanized warfare. There were discussions about breaking them up, scattering them among other units to dilute their influence. The prevailing wisdom at the Pentagon was that warfare had evolved beyond the individual warrior. This was the age of artillery barrages and tank formations, of rigid discipline and following orders without question. General George S. Patton thought that wisdom was horseshit. When he reviewed the divisions assigned to his 7th Army for the invasion of Sicily, he paid special attention to the 45. Patton was many things, most of them unpleasant, but he was no fool when it came to combat. He looked at the service records and saw men who had grown up in the harshest environments in America, men who could navigate by stars, move without sound, and endure conditions that broke soldiers from the cities and suburbs. He saw soldiers who carried a warrior tradition that stretched back centuries, long before there was a United States of America. While other generals saw a problem to be managed, Patton saw a weapon to be unleashed. He personally intervened to keep the Native American soldiers concentrated in their units. He wanted that cohesion, that brotherhood, that shared identity. He knew something the textbooks didn't teach. The most dangerous soldiers aren't the ones who follow orders blindly. They're the ones who understand why they're fighting and choose to bring everything they have to the battle. On July 10, 1943, the invasion of Sicily began in darkness and fury. Operation Husky was the largest amphibious assault in history to that point, with over 160,000 troops hitting the beaches. The landing zones were supposed to be secured quickly, allowing the armored divisions to push inland. But the Mediterranean had other plans. High winds and rough seas scattered the landing craft. Units came ashore miles from their intended positions. The beach at Scoglitti became a nightmare of confusion, with officers trying to reorganize their men while German artillery zeroed in on the waterline. Soldiers huddled behind landing craft and sand dunes, pinned down by machine gun fire from the ridgeline above. This was the moment that separated the survivors from the casualties, the warriors from the victims. The men of the 180th Infantry Regiment hit that same beach under the same fire, but they processed the chaos differently. While other units waited for orders that weren't coming, the Thunderbirds moved. Small teams of Cherokee and Apache soldiers began working their way up the bluffs, using every scrap of cover, every shadow, every fold in the terrain. They had trained for this, but more importantly, their grandfathers had trained them for this. Not in any formal sense, but in the stories told around fires, in the hunting trips that taught patience and observation, in the understanding that survival belongs to those who can read the land and move with it rather than against it. A Choctaw sergeant named Wilson led his squad up a dried creek bed that didn't appear on any map. They emerged behind a German machine gun position and eliminated it with knives before the enemy even knew they were there. Across the beach, similar scenes played out as the native warriors transformed chaos into opportunity. By noon on that first day, while staff officers were still trying to figure out where half their units had landed, the 188th had already pushed 3 miles inland. They weren't waiting for the tanks or the artillery or the air support. They were hunting. German defensive positions that should have taken days to reduce were falling in hours. Patton, monitoring the radio reports from the command ship offshore, kept asking his aides to confirm the updates. The speed of the advance seemed impossible. His intelligence officer suggested the reports might be exaggerated, that the forward units might be overestimating their progress. Patton looked at the map. looked at the Thunderbird insignia marking the 45th Division's positions, and shook his head. He knew exactly what was happening. The weapon he had insisted on keeping intact was cutting through the German defenses like a blade through silk. The Sicilian interior is a landscape of contradictions, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Rolling hills covered in wildflowers give way suddenly to jagged limestone ridges that look like the bones of the earth breaking through skin. In the summer heat of 1943, those hills became a furnace where men fought and died for objectives that most of them couldn't pronounce. The German forces defending Sicily were a mixed bag of Italian coastal divisions that wanted no part of the fight, and elite German units that were determined to bleed the Allies for every yard of ground. Among these elite units were the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, fanatical troops loyal to the Luftwaffe commander himself. These were not the exhausted survivors of Stalingrad or the green recruits scraped from the bottom of the barrel. These were true believers in the Nazi cause, well-equipped and expertly led. They expected to dominate the American forces they had been taught to view as soft and undisciplined. They learned differently at Biscari Airfield. Patton needed that airfield desperately. Control of the air was everything in modern warfare, and without forward bases for fighters and bombers, the invasion would bog down. The Germans knew this too, which is why they had fortified the approaches with mines, bunkers, and interlocking fields of fire that turned the open ground into a killing zone. A textbook assault on such a position would require days of preparation, massive artillery bombardment, and careful coordination between infantry, armor, and air support. Patton didn't have days. The Germans were already preparing demolitions to crater the runways. If the airfield was destroyed, it would be useless even after capture. So Patton did what he did best. He pointed at the objective and told the 180th to go take it. Not next week, not tomorrow. Now. The officers of the regiment looked at the intelligence maps and immediately discarded the obvious approaches. Every road leading to the airfield was covered by German guns. A frontal assault would be suicide. But the terrain to the north was different. It was rough country, steep ravines choked with brush, exposed rock faces that looked unclimbable. The kind of terrain that military planners marked as impassable and ignored. The Native American soldiers looked at that same terrain and saw home. They saw the canyons of New Mexico and Arizona. They saw the badlands they had crossed on foot as children. One Apache corporal looked at his lieutenant and said simply, "We can go that way." The lieutenant, a white officer from Ohio who had learned to trust his men's judgment, nodded. The order went down the line. Light load. Water and ammunition only. Leave the heavy packs. We're going hunting. What followed was a masterclass in unconventional warfare. While German observers watched the roads and prepared for the expected assault, the Thunderbirds were already moving through the impossible terrain. They climbed where no one expected soldiers to climb. They moved during the heat of the day when visibility was reduced by shimmer and haze. They used hand signals instead of radios, maintaining complete communication silence. By the time the sun began to set on July 11th, they were in position on the high ground overlooking the airfield, looking down at the German defenses from behind. The enemy had prepared for an attack from the south and west. They never imagined the Americans would come from the north, from terrain their own reconnaissance had marked as impassable for infantry. The assault began at dusk, that magical hour when the light plays tricks and nothing is quite what it seems. The Germans heard the attack before they saw it, a sudden eruption of rifle fire from a direction that shouldn't have been possible. Confusion spread through their lines faster than any bullet. Were they surrounded? How had the Americans gotten behind them? Veteran sergeants tried to rally their men to organize a coherent defense, but the Thunderbirds weren't giving them time to think. They came down from the high ground like an avalanche, firing as they moved, using the momentum and the failing light to maximum advantage. A Navajo soldier named Benelli threw himself against a bunker door and emptied his Thompson submachine gun through the firing slit, then pulled a German grenade from his belt and finished the job. Beside him, a Creek warrior named George moved from position to position with his M1 Garand, firing with a precision that came from a lifetime of hunting deer in the Oklahoma hills. The battle for Biscari Airfield lasted less than 3 hours. When it was over, the runways were intact and in American hands. The German demolition teams had been eliminated before they could complete their work. Patton arrived the next morning to survey the prize, and what he saw confirmed everything he had believed about the 45th Division. The Thunderbird soldiers were exhausted, covered in dust and cordite. some of them bandaging wounds that they had ignored during the fight. But the airfield was his. Within hours, American fighters would be landing and refueling, extending their range deeper into Sicily. The German Luftwaffe's control of the skies was broken, and the soldiers who had made it possible were already preparing for the next mission, cleaning their weapons and checking their ammunition with the quiet professionalism of men who knew their value. But victory has a cost that doesn't appear on casualty reports. The reputation of the 45th Division as unstoppable problem solvers meant that when the next impossible mission came up, they were the unit that got the call. Bloody Ridge was waiting. It was a knife edge of rock near San Stefano, dominating the coastal road that the Allied advance needed to use. The Germans had turned it into a fortress, with machine gun nests carved into the limestone and mortar positions that could drop shells on anything that moved below. Infantry doctrine was clear. You don't assault a fortified height without massive preparation. You soften it with artillery. You pound it with airstrikes. You wait until the defenders are dead or demoralized, and then you send in the troops to mop up. But once again, time was the enemy. The German reinforcements were racing toward the position. If they arrived before the Americans took the ridge, the entire advance would stall. The 180th looked up at Bloody Ridge and saw death staring back at them. But they also saw something the planners didn't. They saw goat trails and rock chimneys. They saw approaches that weren't on any map because no cartographer had bothered to mark them. They saw a way up. The attack began in darkness with small teams of soldiers beginning the climb. They moved slowly, testing each handhold, supporting each other with whispered words of encouragement. A Choctaw private named Billy slipped on loose rock and nearly fell. But the man below him, a Seminole named Jack, caught his boot and held him until he could find purchase. They didn't know each other before the war. Billy was from Mississippi and Jack from Florida. But in that moment, hanging on the face of a Sicilian cliff in the dark, they were brothers in a bond that went deeper than blood. The Germans didn't realize they were under attack until the first Americans came over the ridgeline just before dawn. The shock was total. These positions were supposed to be impregnable from the front, and no one had considered that infantry could climb the rear approach. But there they were, dirty and panting and absolutely lethal, coming over the rocks with bayonets fixed. What followed was combat at its most primitive and brutal. This wasn't a firefight. This was a knife fight on a mountain. Men grappled and stabbed and threw each other off cliffs. Grenades exploded in confined spaces, and the screams of the wounded echoed across the valley below. The Native American soldiers fought with a ferocity that terrified the Germans. This wasn't about tactics or strategy anymore. This was about survival and brotherhood. Every man on that ridge knew that if they failed, if they retreated, their brothers would die. So they didn't retreat. They pushed forward foot by bloody foot, bunker by bunker, until the ridge was theirs. When the sun finally rose over Bloody Ridge, the survivors stood on the summit and looked out over the Mediterranean. They had won. But the cost was devastating. Men who had grown up together, who had enlisted together and trained together, were now lying dead among the rocks. A Cherokee sergeant named Tom sat with his back against a boulder and wept openly, not from fear or pain, but from grief for his friends who would never see home again. Around him, other soldiers stood in silence, too exhausted and emotionally shattered to speak. They had proven they could take any objective, conquer any position, but the question that nobody wanted to ask was how many more ridges were waiting, and how many more brothers would be left behind on the rocks. Word of the 45th Division's exploits spread through the Allied forces with the speed of legend. British soldiers who had fought in North Africa and considered themselves veterans of hard combat heard the stories and shook their heads in disbelief. French resistance fighters passing intelligence to the Allies began reporting that German troops were specifically requesting not to be deployed against the Thunderbirds, the Nazi propaganda machine, which had spent years dehumanizing non-Aryan peoples, suddenly had to confront the fact that the supposedly inferior Native American warriors were decimating the master race at every encounter. German intelligence officers pored over captured documents and prisoner interrogations, trying to understand what made these soldiers so effective. They never figured it out because the answer wasn't in any manual or training document. The answer was in a heritage and a brotherhood that couldn't be quantified or reproduced. As July turned to August, Patton's ego demanded one final triumph. He was in a race with British General Bernard Montgomery to capture the city of Palermo, and Patton was determined to win, not for any sound military reason, but because he wanted the glory. He wanted the headlines. He wanted to prove that American forces could move faster and hit harder than their British counterparts. So he ordered the 45th Division to make a forced march across more than 100 miles of the most difficult terrain in Sicily. In the middle of summer, with limited water and supplies, it was madness dressed up as strategy. But orders were orders, and the Thunderbirds set out on what would become known as the Death March. The heat was the first enemy. Temperatures soared above 110 degrees, and the roads turned into rivers of dust that choked and blinded. Men's lips cracked and blinded. Men's lips cracked and bled. Their feet swelled in their boots until every step was agony. Soldiers began to hallucinate from dehydration and exhaustion, seeing mortar where there was only rock, hearing voices that weren't there. The medical officers did what they could, but there weren't enough vehicles to carry the men who were collapsing. Those who fell were left by the roadside with the hope that supply trucks would pick them up later. Many of them did. Some didn't. And still the Thunderbirds marched. They marched because stopping meant failure, and failure meant their brothers would have suffered for nothing. They marched because giving up wasn't in their vocabulary, not in English, and not in any of the tribal languages they spoke among themselves. They reached Palermo on July 22nd, ahead of the British, ahead of schedule, ahead of what anyone thought possible. They entered the city not as a triumphant army, but as a column of ghosts. Their uniforms were white with dust. Their eyes were hollow. Some of them could barely stand. The citizens of Palermo threw flowers and cheered, but the soldiers of the 188th hardly noticed. They had walked through hell to get there, and hell had left its mark. Patton got his headlines. He got his photos and his congratulations from the brass. But the men who had delivered his victory knew the truth. They had been used. Their suffering had been the price of one man's ambition, and that knowledge, bitter as it was, would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The Sicily campaign ended on August 17, 1943, with the German evacuation across the Strait of Messina. The Allies had won, but it had taken 38 days of brutal combat to secure an island that pre-invasion estimates had suggested would fall in 2 weeks. The 45th Division had been in the thick of it from the first day to the last, and their casualty lists reflected that commitment. Hundreds dead, thousands wounded, all of them fighting for a country that treated them as second-class citizens when they weren't wearing a uniform. The injustice of it was staggering. These men couldn't vote in some of their home states. They faced discrimination and prejudice at every turn. Yet when their nation called, they had answered without hesitation and fought with a courage that shamed those who had dismissed them as inferior. When the war finally ended in 1945 and the surviving Thunderbirds returned home, they found that victory in Europe hadn't translated to victory at home. They came back to the same reservations, the same poverty, the same systemic racism that had defined their lives before the war. They put their medals in drawers and tried to resume lives that had been interrupted by 4 years of horror. Many of them never spoke about what they had done, not out of modesty, but because they knew that their white neighbors wouldn't believe them, and their fellow tribal members didn't need to hear about more suffering. The war had changed them in ways they couldn't articulate, giving them nightmares and memories that wouldn't fade. They had seen the worst of humanity in the Nazi regime, and they had discovered the best of humanity in the brotherhood of combat. Those two truths existed side by side, irreconcilable and eternal. The legacy of the Native American soldiers of World War II has been slowly, grudgingly acknowledged over the decades since. There are memorials now, and museums, and the occasional documentary that tells part of their story. But the full truth of what they accomplished and what they sacrificed remains largely unknown to the American public. They were the warriors who weren't supposed to be warriors anymore. The men who had been told to forget their heritage and assimilate into white society. Yet when the moment came, when the world needed soldiers who could move like smoke and fight like demons, it was that very heritage that made them invaluable. They proved that the warrior spirit cannot be legislated away or educated out of existence. It lives in the blood and the bone, waiting for the moment when it's needed most. The Thunderbird patch, that yellow bird on a red diamond, still flies with military units today. Soldiers who wear it may not know the full story of the 45th Division in Sicily, but they carry the legacy, whether they know it or not. They carry the memory of men who climbed impossible cliffs and took fortified positions that should have been impregnable. They carry the spirit of warriors who marched until their feet bled and fought until their ammunition ran out. Most of all, they carry the proof that courage and honor are not the property of any single race or nation. They belong to anyone willing to stand up when the moment demands it, to protect their brothers, and to face death with their eyes open and their heads held high. That is the lesson of the Apache Battalion, written in blood on the rocks of Sicily, and it echoes down through the years to us today.